Over the past number of years, from time to time, I've been a part of plays and musicals and different community theater activities. And community theater has a lot of traditions. And one of the traditions I really like at Elkhart Civic Theater is before every show, there's a circle time. Directors and actors and crew and everybody who's involved stands in a circle to kind of pump up and encourage each other before the show. And after some announcements and things, you go around the circle and everyone shares the same word of encouragement around the circle. And one show I was a part of, every night we said the same phrase. Starting with the director, we'd go around the circle and look at the person to our right and give their hand a squeeze and say, "I give you my best. I give you my best." It's this beautiful invitation and gift. I love the feeling of abundance and celebration in community theater when everyone is intentionally sharing their best gifts, their best energy, and love for the storytelling and the creative experience. Nobody carries it all. The abundance is in the community and in the work, and it's all of us giving and receiving. It's that way in congregational life as well. We all bring our best gifts in response to the creative and loving energy of God in our midst. I thought of this when Jesus shows up at this wedding in Cana to give his best out of God's abundance, even though it sounds like he didn't really feel like doing it. In each of the four Gospels in the New Testament, Jesus begins his ministry in the little towns around the Sea of Galilee. Matthew and Mark both pick up on his time in Capernaum, where right away he begins preaching about the generous reign of God, and his first miracles are miracles of healing, where he's ministering God's compassion to people who are hurting in mind and in body. Luke, on the other hand, in the beginning of his gospel, goes with Jesus right away to his home village of Nazareth, where he again preaches in the synagogue. And he proclaims good news for those who are poor and freedom for those who are prisoners. Now, in John's gospel that we just heard, John is the gospel that likes to be different. And John starts Jesus off in Cana at a wedding reception. Unlike the other three gospels, Jesus hasn't done any teaching yet or preaching, and his first miracle is not a healing. In fact, John doesn't use the word miracle at all. John talks about signs. And Jesus' first sign in John's gospel is to make more wine for the party. Celebrate good times. Come on. Now, seeing an awkward Mennonite guy just dance a little bit made you remember almost any wedding reception you've been to since 1980, especially with that song, right? That's the time it was at the wedding of Cana. The time for that kind of a song. The time when everybody comes together to dance and to celebrate, even if we don't think we can dance, or we're pretty sure we can't dance, or we don't feel like it. We join in, we make our little contribution to the celebration of abundant love, not just for the couple, but for their friends and their family and the community and all of us. We celebrate. And that's what Jesus and his mother and his friends had come there to do, to celebrate God's abundance. And in Jesus' culture and time, a wedding feast didn't just happen in a couple hours after the wedding. It would go on for a week, an entire week. And it wasn't just a party, it was a community event. And it usually would happen around harvest time. so they could celebrate the abundance in more ways than one, health and well-being for the couple and the community. And this story happens to take place in a part of the world where the harvest isn't about corn and tomatoes, but it's about olives and grapes, oil and wine. Running out of wine it's not just a little bit of a bummer. Like they're out of cheesecake in the dessert buffet or something like that. It's very serious. It was a blow to the reputation of the groom's family. Like, didn't they take care of their vines? Or are they unwilling to share of their harvest at this wedding? The unthinkable is happening at this party. And Jesus' mother is just having none of it. She may have had some connections to the groom's family. It seems to me she felt very comfortable going over to the servants and saying, do whatever he tells you to do. And she kind of cocked her head and raised a motherly eyebrow at Jesus. It's not much of a leap to think this couple might have been relatives of Jesus and Mary. So Mary cares. She loves these people. She loves this community, and she knows that Jesus loves these people too and wants to give the best. Love wants to give its best, wants to help. But Jesus hasn't made a move yet. And when Mary mentions to him that the wine has run out, he says, I'm not sure it's my problem. Even so, his mother seems confident that there is no need for emptiness at this celebration, not when God's fullness is sitting right there next to her, just waiting to pour out and to fill that place. And the fullness of God must have sort of overcome Jesus too at some point. It's amazing. Look, he said very clearly, my hour has not yet come. This wine thing is not our responsibility. He said he wasn't ready to do what the poem at the very beginning of John's Gospel says, that the Word would reveal the light that shines in darkness, would reveal the glory of God, full of grace and truth. God's abundance was even greater, apparently, than Jesus' sense of timing at this party. And Jesus went with it. He trusted it, right time or not. And those 6 empty water jugs that he asked the servants to fill with water, those old jugs overflowed with celebration wine, the very best wine you can imagine. Gallons of it. And so the first sign in John's gospel is abundance. The celebration is on, and the fullness of God's love will never run out. And we're invited into that fullness and to share from it as well. Jesus himself gives out of that fullness from God and for the community. He loves these people. And in this story, we see that abundance comes alive in relationship. Bill read from the insert in your bulletin about our stewardship series, that we're thinking about more than what we do with money, though that's important, but about a whole life relational response to God and God's abundant generosity to us. In other words, in a focus on giving that comes once a year, we might not just figure out how much money we can and might choose to give, even though that's an extremely important part of it. We also remember and reflect on where the invitation and where the desire to give comes from, flowing out of the love we receive from God and the invitation to share it in a multitude of ways. Like Jesus did at this wedding, giving his best out of God's fullness. And in doing this, even though he may not have been ready, Jesus met a real need in this community for these people that he loved. Now, I've only been around City Church for a few months, and mostly just connected here in worship and in the office a little bit during the week. But I have noticed some ways that this congregation flows with God's abundant love. That's a part of your life as a congregation. I came last spring to the last Wednesday evening meal that happened in that season. And the kids in community, this looks to me like abundance in action. Sharing God's love in you with each other and with the community through time and food and teaching and friendship and love and energy and contributions of money to keep things going. You care about each other in this congregation. That's clear to me. That you know one another deeply and care. And that abundance and depth of relationship, I think, is a gift that can flow over to others who are invited into it. And I see you doing that with the neighborhood children and others who come and who may seem to claim this church as their own, and rightly so, even if they don't come on Sunday morning. And on First Fridays as well. You give and share abundance and fun and friendship and food with the community. Thank you for doing that. And I'm not saying that just so you can get a well-deserved pat on the back, even though it is well-deserved. But I think of it as an example and a reminder that this is a reflection of your response to God's abundance. And maybe there are other responses you feel called to explore. I think these are some signs of healthy congregations also. Caring relationships that extend beyond Sunday morning, meaningful projects and ministry done together, and humor. This congregation has a lot of humor. I don't want to say you laugh at one another, but with one another. And that's really good. And you should cherish that and count it as spiritual work, a kind of prayer, God's abundance poured out in laughter and in the gift of not taking yourselves too seriously. Jesus was able to do that too. I think that's clear when you read what Jesus does and says in the Gospels. And this is the Christ, God's love in flesh. And the Gospels do us a favor by letting us see Jesus in the flesh as a real human being. A human being who, in this story, didn't want to worry about the wine. Come on, I didn't feel like doing this today. But the fullness of God flows over him and through him, and he gets caught up in the celebration and the fun and the love that's called for. He responds. He lets himself go there in the spirit of extravagant love. But Jesus also understood that God's abundance is something to be taken very seriously. And how we give from that abundance is serious. Look where Jesus goes after the wedding party. Spends a few days in Capernaum. But then he goes on to Jerusalem, to the temple. And the temple is the place for the Jewish people in Jesus' time. The temple was the sacred home of God, the home of God's presence. And when Jesus gets there and sees people selling animals for sacrifice and changing money and filling up the place with profit-making, he knows that's what they're doing. And he knows that it hurts the poor and the outsiders most. And he knows that they're blocking this space that was created and intended for outsiders to come and pray, even Gentiles or travelers or visitors, non-Jews, anyone who wants to come and stay in that outer space and pray. They're cluttering it up with this activity. And Jesus gets very serious when he sees all this. If you remember what happened, he goes from celebration mode into demonstration mode, and he makes a bit of a scene. Jesus knocks over some tables, and bird cages hit the ground, and doves are flying out into the open sky, and there's coins rolling around in the mess, and Jesus climbs up on a makeshift cattle pen or something to make a speech, and the cow was wandering off into the chaos. And Jesus says, this is supposed to be a house of prayer, where God's fullness is meant to overflow. But they were trying to hoard God's fullness and make money off of God's fullness and put bouncers at the door to keep certain people out of the celebration of God's fullness. And Jesus would have none of it. God's abundant love is the inheritance of all people. We receive it, we share it, and that's it. Easy instructions. And how we give of our abundance is serious because we know that not everyone is experiencing God's abundance right now. Not everyone can say, I feel so abundant right now. We know the needs that are in our communities and in our families and in our world. Sometimes we experience those needs and reach out for help. We receive God's abundance, we share it. Jesus had a friend, Mary, and in John chapter 12, she is a good example of sharing this abundance. I don't know if you remember the story, but they're visiting together. She takes a flask of very, very expensive oil and she cracks it open and she gets down on her knees and she lets the oil flow over Jesus' feet and she takes the hairpins out of her hair and she starts massaging his feet with this oil. And some of the disciples get really angry. This extravagance and abundance is supposed to be a serious thing. And why is she wasting this? She should have saved the oil in preparation for someone's death. That's what this oil was for. Or maybe someone else needed it. Or she could have sold it and given the money to someone in need. It's a waste. What a terrible waste. But Jesus didn't think so. In the gospel, where the first sign is Jesus filling empty water jugs with wine for the party, this kind of argument doesn't fly. Jesus stands up for her and honors her and reminds everyone who hears the story that the celebration of God's fullness and love and life is always open for everyone, even in dark times, even when death is near, as it was for Jesus. Celebrate and share God's abundance, the fullness of God's love that will never, God's love and abundance. God's love never runs out or runs dry or becomes empty. Mary, Jesus' mother, gave her best in noticing the need, in loving the people in need, in asking Jesus to help. Jesus' friend gave her best with the extravagant oil. Jesus brought the fullness of God and gave his best to the wedding feast, the best he could give in response to that love and need. And as we consider how and what we give of ourselves, our talents, time, energy, money, Jesus invites us to celebrate, in good times and bad times, to celebrate the fullness of God's love, which is for all times, the abundance that is ours, to give and to receive. Thanks be to God.